Well, for all lang syne, my friend, this is Wednesday, December the 30th, 2015. Very, very late in the year. We're looking forward to 2016, and no better time than the New Year's holiday weekend to welcome in our friend, the Golden Jackass himself, Jim Willie. Jim, as most of you know, is editor of the Hat Trick Letter found at goldenjackass.com. He is a frequent visitor to TFMR, and we always like to have him in over these three-day holiday weekends so we can get an extended version of his current thoughts. So, Jim, happy end of 2015. Happy New Year to you, and thanks for joining us here at TFMR.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Pleasure to be on, Craig. It's the end of a rather turbulent year. I call it the Endless Wars. And for those who really can't get a firm grip on it, the wars are to defend the dollar.
Yep.
The wars are to prevent our allies from abandoning the United States. By that I mean Europe and Russia joining to make the Eurasian trade zone. The wars are about stopping other energy supply channels from linking up to Europe, which would isolate the United States. So it's a war, a series of wars to defend the dollar and to prevent the U.S. economic and commercial isolation. And it's never portrayed that way.
Right.
That's the important part. I mean, I talked to a number of people, and it's actually very annoying. I had a long conversation with actually a friend from my Pennsylvania days back in 03, 4, 5, and 6, a neighbor and a fellow member of a sports club. You know, we used to sit by the pool and check out the bikinis and the fat people, and just have a good time sipping iced tea and talking away. Well, I talked with this friend, and very disturbing. And I got annoyed, and I was told, hey, tone it down, Jim, tone it down. We're just friends talking. And I said, yeah, I know, but what it points out is the extraordinary ignorance of the people, and apparently you're one of them. And that wasn't received all that well, but that's okay. That's okay. I insult a lot of people. I have a lot of practice in recovering from it. And it was over some of the political planks out there,
right?
Priorities of the day, the debates, the candidates. And I'm not going to get into a single candidate during this discussion, but I just got tired. I'm impatient talking with people who maintain a rather firm opinion without having much information that's solid. Well, and that's the way our country's going. We have a lot of people who have opinions, and they mouth off, and they're firm, and they think this or that, and yeah. They don't know anything about what's going on.
Well, we should start there, Jim, because I think we probably... everybody listening to us probably just had that experience in the last week or so, where you get together at your Christmas party, your holiday event, whatever, and you got your family there, you got some friends there, and yeah, it's a long day. Topics eventually come up, and you start talking to people about the U.S. economy, or the big banks, or the geopolitical situation, as you're mentioning. And why events transpire the way they are, because I'm with you. It's all about the defense of the dollar. That's the number one national priority of the U.S. government, it seems, is protecting that dollar reserve currency status. So I wanted to ask you first about the Fed, but I think instead I'm going to go first toward a continuance of this discussion, because events in the Middle East are the focal point, and it is all about defending the dollar. What are your thoughts there about the ongoing action as it relates to what's happening in Syria, maybe the natural gas pipelines that are planned through there to support our friends, the Saudis, the pivotal role that Turkey and that nasty Erdogan play in all of this going forward. It sure looks like we're going to have an interesting year, and I would imagine you've got some interesting thoughts on the subject.
Well, that's a rather huge opening question. I would need, honestly, an hour to answer.
All right, well, pick off your favorite part.
I'm going to try to answer at a high level and not get into too many details, but some are required. To begin with, when the Iraqi government was formed after our invasion, which I think was completely illegal, improper, false pretenses.
Right.
We ended up stealing the Iraqi gold, put out stories of taking or finding in a cave a bunch of yellow painted wooden bricks. That was your hint, we stole their gold. But we came to learn that the Iraqi government was very Shiite. It was 2/3 Shiite. It's also called Shia. I call it Shiite.
If you ain't Sunni, you ain't Shiite.
Yeah. Well, there's a third secular group called the Ba'ath, B-A-A-T-H, and that's what Saddam Hussein came from. He wasn't religious at all. He was just criminal.
Right.
And his best friend was Papa Bush. But anyway, the point is that we decided as a nation, government and military, that the Iraqi parliament was way too dominated by pro-Iran Shiites. So we left town. And as soon as we left town, in came ISIS. So this is very important because the U.S. has two armies. One is the Pentagon and one is the Langley mercenaries. The Pentagon is paid by the U.S. government deficits. I love that joke. They're paid with money that's just printed and borrowed from our enemies who pay our bills, and then we attack them with our military. So that's one of the advantages of having a global reserve currency. All the victims of our military pay for the military. Why would they want to invest in treasury bonds? Because if they don't, they'll be attacked. But if they do, they're still attacked. So in came ISIS, which is funded by narcotics. It's not just Langley narcotics. It's all their allies, like the Saudis, who are very deep in the narcotics, and the Turks. Turkey is very deep into the narcotics. So Putin of Russia didn't like it. He's really angry at the whole concept of ISIS and the deceptions. He decided to make it his mission to expose ISIS for what it was. The U.S. government and its, I call it, fascist axis, namely Britain and Israel, and apparently more than I realized before, the Saudis. They're a key part of the fascists. They're not a democratic state.
No.
So what are they? Well, they're a monarchy, yeah, but what is that? Well, it's pretty much a fascist state with a bunch of privileged princes running around, maybe several hundred of them, pretending to be important. So ISIS is getting exposed. I was told back in 2013, wait for the day when the U.S. regular military encounters the Langley military and blood is spilled. Because then you're going to have all hell breaking loose, and it will become apparent that the U.S. has two militaries. One funded by the taxpayer. I love that phrase.
Yeah.
Taxpayer doesn't even cover the bill, so how does it cover the military? The government bill. And the other one is paid for by narcotics. If you think the narcotics angle is small, you're dead wrong. The total amount of sold narcotics by Langley and their allies is somewhere between $800 billion and $1,200 billion a year, and 80% of the heroin comes from Afghanistan.
Yeah.
It may be a surprise to some people to learn that the entire war in Afghanistan is a bunch of rubbish. The reasons stated, a bunch of rubbish. and were there to lock down the monopoly on heroin. We were actually in there before 2003. We were in there as soon as the Soviet Union left in 2000. And that was a new revelation to me. So what's going on? The U.S. military had a long list of ISIS targets about 4 or 5 months ago and never attacked any of them.
Right.
It's like, let's put them all on the board, the big board on the wall, and that's not our target list, that's our sacred list.
This is what we want to avoid.
Right. So we put out stories of knocking out the rebel ISIS installations and depots in Aleppo, Syria, when really what we did was we completely destroyed their electricity generating station. So we're trying to knock out the Syrian infrastructure while we claim to be going after ISIS strongholds when we're not, because ISIS is us.
Right.
And Putin pretty much laid that out at a G20 summit. He went before the crowd and he said, I'm going to show you a bunch of slides that shows the movement of the funding. And a lot of it has a core in Switzerland for all the different ISIS groups. And it's not like a hierarchical central command. It's more like a flat organization chart with a lot of limbs going down. You've got, oh gosh, I could go on and on about this, but it's just not worth it. You've got Turkmen, you've got Chechen, you've got Russian, you got Saudis, Jordanians, you got Northern Africans, you got all kinds of different groups there. And the U.S. and Israel are dead set on destroying Hezbollah. Okay, that's their mission. And that's been their mission for 50 years, 40 years, ever since Beirut was destroyed. And if you ever wonder why Beirut was destroyed, the answer is simple. Because Beirut wanted to be the banking center for all the Arab oil sales.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So it got destroyed.
Interesting.
Yeah. I had an office mate in graduate school, Badi Baltaji, a very nice, sweet fellow from Lebanon who went to the American University of Lebanon. And he pointed out quite a number of things. And he was sad about, and this was 1977 that I met him, 76 and 7, and he got his master's and left at Carnegie Mellon. But he was sad about what was happening to his country. So, all right, so back to ISIS. Russia is knocking out ISIS flat. Russia, in a matter of something like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, destroyed a great deal of the core for ISIS. Their depot lines, their ammunition centers, their pathways, their bridges, all their routes, they pretty well got knocked out. And in the meantime, Russia displayed some new military technology that had not been seen before, namely 2,000-mile-long cruise missiles with deadly accuracy that makes the U.S. Tomahawk missile a bit obsolete. And it's not in violation of a NATO treaty because it superseded a treaty. They took advantage of a hole that was left in there because they didn't think it was possible to have a 2,000-mile range, supersonic, high-accuracy missile. And furthermore, the Russians have let it be known that they've got a supersonic torpedo. Sounds kind of weird, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But they've got it. They've demoed it. They've demoed a lot of things. So
tell me then, Turkey obviously is kind of a flashpoint, and we're finding out a lot about, well, the world finally is finding out a lot about Erdogan, and what a bad guy he is, and them being the central distribution point for ISIS's oil. And now Turkey and Russia has become quite a flashpoint, it seems, going forward. What do you know there? What do you know about Erdogan and the role that Turkey's going to play in 2016 in this whole crisis?
regime change.
You know
Erdogan,
what?
I call it Erdogan. I don't know how to correct. I call it Erdogan.
It's
call it
Erdogan. Erdogan, yeah.
Erdogan. Well, pardon me if I continue to call it Erdogan.
You can call him anything you want because he's not a good guy.
I can call him Wyatt Earp if I want, but
Sure.
I'm going to try to make it clear. I call it Erdogan because I've always called it incorrectly Erdogan. Okay.
Fair enough.
What is going on? What is the main motive for this whole conflict in Syria? Real simple. The Iran gas pipeline. Okay? It's cheap gas to be pipelined through northeast Iraq, through parts of what's called Kurdistan, the disputed area, to Syria, to the Mediterranean port, for the European market. Same motive as Ukraine.
Right.
Ukraine is to block the cheaper Russian gas from entering the European market, making partners commercially of Russia with Europe. The United States does not want Iran to become commercial partners with Europe, so they would prefer that Europe buy the much more expensive Qatari liquefied natural gas.
Which now, and I have maintained that for months. So folks here on the site are hearing a lot of what I keep saying, and then that the alternative and why the Sauds so badly want Assad to go and want the U.S. to go in and help get rid of Assad is so that they can build an Arabian-based pipeline through Syria. Correct or not?
Well, I really don't know much about a Saudi or Arabian pipeline alternative. I do know rather clearly that the bulk of Arab gas sales would be Qatari LNG.
Got it. Okay.
Most of the gas projects in the Gulf region are supplied to the Qataris for their gigantic LNG facility, which carries a certain degree of irony because they're very closely working on the technology with Russia. That's your irony.
Got it. Yeah.
But the Qataris and the UAE and they're heavily funding, and Saudi, obviously Saudi, are heavily funding ISIS. And I just read an article that there's so many ISIS guerrillas getting killed that the Saudis just made an offer to 1,200 of their prisoners in Saudi Arabia that they will suddenly be given two choices. They will be beheaded or they will fight for ISIS in the Syrian front.
Some choice.
Well, they, surprisingly, they decided to join up and take arms.
No kidding. Yeah.
All right. So back to Turkey. Turkey is very deeply involved in the narcotics, as is Saudi Arabia, which is tied in with the Bush family. So this is all coming out. There was a story about a month ago of a Saudi prince caught with 32 boxes of heroin. And these were, regular-sized office boxes, like you would see 24 reams of paper in, or even slightly larger in size.
Okay.
The Saudi prince was, how should I say, stopped but not arrested. The heroin was logged but not confiscated.
Right.
In other words, this Saudi prince got caught and passed through because the narcotics is used to pay the ISIS guerrillas. This alternative Langley army is entirely funded by narcotics, and they thought it would be a good idea to augment their standard narcotics channels with black market oil. So they've stolen a good deal of the oil in the southern lands of Syria. They just overrun an oil installation. They tell the people running it, you can continue and work for us or we'll shoot you, or they don't cut anybody's heads off. If you want proof of that, just ask John McCain, because the Arizona senator hired a bunch of studios to make the falsified videos. And that was found on his email for the congressional computer in his office. But again, he won't get tried for treason because he's a connected little idiot. He's one of the dumbest people ever to set foot in the Senate. I doubt he's smarter than Bush too. So back to Turkey. They're getting revealed as being part, this includes Erdogan's son, being part of the very deep and diversified narcotics and black market oil. I got a very interesting message 3 weeks ago from one of my clients who works on Wall Street. And he said, Jim, I really don't understand this. I don't like what I'm seeing because there are at least 2 or 3 Wall Street firms, the big Wall Street banks, who are involved in purchasing and selling the ISIS black market oil. This is all through the Western commercial entities.
Right.
It's not just the Saudi petrochemical industry. It's not just the side businesses run by Erdogan's son. No, it's all through probably London and Wall Street. They're making money on this because, you know, they need to offset some of the money they lost in underwriting oil hedges. This is going to end very badly, and I think what's going to happen is we're going to see the first example of a European eastward flip. I don't think it's going to be Germany first. I think it's going to be Turkey. When Turkey shot down that Russian MiG, what was that, in late November?
Yeah.
I think it was right around Thanksgiving.
Yeah, about 6 weeks ago.
Yeah. What they did was they signed a death warrant for the Erdogan regime. I heard stories that it was a direct order from Langley to shoot it down because they want a wider war.
Right.
I also heard that it was possibly a pocket within the Turkish military that was not really following the Turkish high brass, their Pentagon, whatever it is.
Right.
So it's very confusing, but clearly to me, if they block ships in the Bosporus for Russian naval passage,
Right.
they're inviting big trouble.
Right.
And for those who are really wondering, what other role does Turkey play in the ISIS game? The U.S. Embassy in Ankara, Turkey, is the ISIS field operations headquarters. I mean, this is very dirty stuff.
Yeah, Jim. Let me. I'm going to try to. I want to try to summarize this myself, and then you can tell me how close this is to the way you see things. Because I try to put these things together in my mind, what I do on a daily basis, and then here I visit with you every 6-8 weeks, and you add some extra color in what you're seeing and hearing. If you go back, then let's just go back 2 or 3 years ago. Again, viewing this through the lens of preservation of the dollar ultimately, and U.S. hegemony and dollar reserve currency status, and how important that is to maintain. I mean, that's the linchpin. Because if that falls, everything goes to hell here in the U.S. And it's going to fail eventually. But to pacify, mollify, whatever, our allies, or to keep the natural gas from flowing from Iran or whatever. First, we had 2 different things. It was Ukraine, where the wall was put up, obviously, and everything in the U.S.-sponsored coup that's now was almost 2 years ago. But then you had this thing in Syria back, what was it, the summer of 2013 maybe? Or yeah, it was the summer of 2013 when, you know, Obama had his red line that wasn't going to be crossed with the manufactured, it seemed, evidence of chemical weapons use in Syria. And now Obama wants to attack, and then suddenly he gets wise and doesn't do it. But then it wasn't long after that all of a sudden we started hearing about ISIS. And if I remember right, it was because there was allegedly 40,000 Yazidis that were trapped on this mountainside. About the same time, I think August of 2014, about a year later, all of a sudden, these poor Yazidis are you know, it's a humanitarian disaster that's coming on this mountain in Syria, and we've got to go in and airlift them some food And then this whole operation against ISIS has kind of come from there. So it was, as I try to tie all this together, because there's obviously, Zero Hedge has done this great work about the origins of ISIS and whether the U.S. knew that they would come about, U.S. helped them come about, whatever. You know, you got to kind of try to connect as many dots as you can. But ISIS is this army then, funded by the Saudis, funded covertly through, as you were saying, maybe drug sales, to fight and destabilize not only Syria, but also the Shiites in Iraq. And Russia, recognizing that this, and now ISIS, you know, purporting to do these terrorist acts in Paris and other places, Russia has the cards that they can lay on the table to say, look, this is all the U.S., you know, pulling all these different strings to try to promote their agenda, and they can lay these cards out for the U.S.'s, I guess, former allies, or potentially former allies throughout the EU, most importantly Germany and others, to draw them eventually into this new sphere that you have always called the Eurasian Alliance. I don't know if any of that, what I've just said over the last 3 minutes, makes any sense, but is that loosely how it all connects?
I think so, yes. And for those who are wondering, why does Russia care so much, think back to the old Soviet Union. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Chechnya, well, you know, Chechnya is a very vague region. It's more like a tribe that congregates in a lot of areas. All right, Putin does not want the ornery, violent Muslims inside Russia or at Russia's borders to start problems inside Russia. It's already too late because Langley has summoned them, organized them, and funded them, and has various little projects inside Russia and the former Soviet republics just to become a giant needle in Russia's side. And Putin doesn't like it. Putin's dealing with a lot of broken U.S. Treaties. Treaties made with NATO. We've broken all of them. Yet we paint Putin to be the bad guy. You know, figure that out. There's something that's happened just in the last few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. John Kerry made a trip to Russia. And to say his tail was between his legs is a gigantic, gross understatement.
Yeah, that's certainly what it seemed like.
Something happened, and there's been a lot of speculation, and you know me, I like to stick my neck out a little bit and take a guess on what happened. But to begin with, Kerry said, we changed our minds here in Washington. I love when they call him President Assad. King Assad, he's a king, he's a royal, he's a dictator. Come on, what are we talking about here? King Assad can stay as leader in Damascus and Syria. He can stay. Furthermore, Kerry said, we will demand that the Turks remove all their troops from Syria and Iraq. Wow! What was that all about, Mr. Kerry?
Yeah, kind of came from
with your rebuilt jaw?
Yeah.
That's a bit hard to understand without being informed as to what Putin said to the U.S. government or demonstrated, this is very important, or demonstrated to the Pentagon.
Or informed through back channels, you know, of the cards that they hold in their hand.
Yeah, but the Pentagon doesn't care about information on cards. They care about demos.
I guess that's true, yeah.
Okay, the USS Donald Cook is now a historical event that took the center of a historical event that took place around April of 2014.
I know where you're going.
Okay. the MiGs flew around in the Black Sea and disabled the Aegis, that's A-E-G-I-S. It's not just a targeting system.
It's a missile defense system. It's a
defense system and a targeting system. Okay, if they want to shoot down an airplane, or if they want to shoot down a cruise missile or try, if they want to shoot down a, let's just say a series of RPGs and whatever,
right?
Rocket-propelled grenades, they employ their targeting system. Well, the MiGs disabled it, and that it had the Pentagon pissing in their pants so bad that several months later they abandoned the Persian Gulf of all their naval vessels. In other words, they saw them as sitting ducks.
Yep.
Okay, there's more. What I've come to learn from my contacts, I don't mean to boast or say, look, I've got these extensive military contacts and I called them up and asked them what's going on. No, I wait for certain contacts of mine to pass on word of various things. I do what I call passive research. I open my inbox or I get on a Skype call to somebody in Europe who I have a lot of respect for. Well, what I've come to learn is that this jamming device that the Russian military deployed on the USS Donald Cook has a macro big brother. They can deploy it and jam the electronic targeting systems for a whole region. I mean like a few hundred square miles.
Wow.
Right. That is what I think Putin described or maybe demoed.
Yeah.
Because when they do a demo that the U.S. Pentagon doesn't like, they do their damnedest to prevent it from becoming news. So Putin might have said, we're going to do a demo in the western region of Syria, and you can keep your news blackout if you wish, but we just want you to see its effect, because we want to see a new direction in this Syrian war. The war is to stop the Iranian gas pipeline from reaching the European market, just like Ukraine is to stop the Russian Gazprom pipeline from reaching the European market.
Yep.
And it's much bigger than that, because 2 years ago, I think it was 2013, the Saudis, through their engineering and other funding groups, blocked the Iranian-Pakistani pipeline. So they're doing a full-court press here to stop Iran from being an energy supplier to Europe and other allies like Pakistan, like India. Anytime you hear Pakistan, think India also. India wants the Iran pipeline to be completed, and the Chinese are making sure that it will be completed. And what the U.S. wants to do is the same thing they did with Ukraine. Make Syria a scorched earth country with ruined infrastructure where no construction firm will even want to do a pipeline. They've got to be done by construction firms. Well, are they going to all have military protection for them? I mean, protecting against a cruise missile is not easy. So I think we're going to see a number of changes come maybe kind of soon with Turkey. And I think the Turkish regular military, not their fringe that's working with ISIS, and not their fringe that's working with Erdogan's son, with black market arms, black market oil, black market you name it. I think the standard central Turkish military command is going to engineer a coup.
Well, and
it's going to be done with some encouragement by Russia to make sure that those who are left standing and running the offices are not belligerent to Russia. Because let me guarantee you something. If a Russian neighbor like Turkey wants to start a dust-up with Russia, they're going to be toast in 1 month.
If less than that, I would imagine. And I would point out, too, Jim, from what I understand about Turkey, and I've studied this for a couple of years now, that was the structure, the infrastructure even, if you want to call it that, the constitutional infrastructure that Ataturk set up after World War II, World War I. I'm not exactly certain of the period, but he set up the structure, the government structure, so that it would always be a secular nation. And if anyone tried, as Erdogan has, to make it instead a dictatorship or to bring in the Islamist structure, that's what Ataturk seek to root out. And he built into their constitution, really, the ability for the military to go in by coup and remove this person. So what you're suggesting is not unprecedented or outrageous. It would almost be expected.
It would follow the Ataturk beliefs and credos and planks,
exactly.
Whatever you want to call them.
Exactly.
Platforms. Okay. Well, in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a lot of controversy inside Turkey about how exactly what you described has been happening. A lot more alliance with the Islamic cause.
Yes.
And it's been encouraged by Langley and the NGO, non-government organizations, funding the Muslim groups inside Turkey that go counter to what the foundations of Turkey. I think it was after World War I, but I'm not sure.
Well, the fall of the Ottoman Empire and all that is when Ataturk had his influence and set it all up.
Yeah. Well, Turkey has some other things before we move to anything else. I got to mention this.
Okay, go ahead.
Their currency is down hard.
Right.
Okay? And the result of that is everything they import is costing more. Yep. The result of that is a desperation because they can't print money to cover it, like the United States does with their $1 trillion deficit per year, which I forecasted back in 2008. Every year, $1 trillion deficit. All right, so Turkey is trying now to close their deficit with exports. So you're now seeing shortages in Turkey in their economy. You're seeing price inflation and shortages, the worst of both worlds. Their Turkish lira is in deep, deep trouble.
Right.
They're going to have economic chaos, and that is, I believe, going to be the justification for the Turkish military to take action.
Yeah.
Look what these guys, with all their Islamic, non-Ataturk attitudes, have done. They've wrecked our country.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you get the
I think
civil
we're going to
unrest
see it become a wasteland, economic wasteland. Not like Ukraine. Ukraine has suffered tremendously from, let's not leave out the 3 or 4 micronuclear detonations that have taken place in Ukraine that are kept out of the Western press. But we're going to see a wasteland created for Turkey. And let's just get a couple more details in there. Russia has blocked the... I think it's 300,000 tourists from entering Turkey. Okay, so the Turkish tourist trade is going to be wrecked. Not just that, but Russia also said we don't want any of, I think they haven't been able to enjoy any agricultural exports from Turkey since the Russian ban way back. But what Putin did was something very clever. He asked Egypt, which is no longer a U.S. colony anymore, he asked Egypt to divert all their exports of fruits and vegetables no longer to go to Turkey, but to go to Russia instead, adding to the shortages inside the Turkish economy. So we got a lot of little, I call them chess moves by a chess master.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to see Turkey end the year the way it starts. And I like that as a forecast because when I was on your show way back in 2014 at Christmas, I said we're going to see a lot of different things happen with the dollar and the treasury bond and the derivatives breaking and the petrodollar dismantled system for the derivatives. The whole structure is going to start to break in noticeable ways, and I think it has. And I'd really like to get onto this, the Fed rate hike and how that ties together with a lot of things here, Craig.
Well, that's where I thought we would go next. That it was something that they've discussed in Jawbone now really since the beginning of QE3 in 2012. It was all about...
Wait a minute. I thought we're up to QE 176. Well, yeah. I'm a little confused here.
Just trying to use the common vernacular, I guess.
Well, the common vernacular calls it a sluggish recovery. I hope you don't buy into that, too.
Well, I'm just
giving you a bad time, Craig.
Going back to the stated program of October 2012, which was over $1 trillion new dollars, which was, to support the economy, when in fact all they were doing was buying all this toxic, worth pennies on the dollar BS off of the bank's balance sheets, or at least that's what half of it was. Nonetheless, don't pay attention to this $1 trillion that we just printed and devalued the currency. No, instead pay attention to the fact that that's all it's going to be, that soon we will taper this program to nothing. And then once that was done, then soon we'll be raising rates. And though they pulled the rug out from under everybody several times in 2015, as most everyone knows, all of a sudden they did get around to their 25 basis point rate hike here a couple of weeks ago. Jim, there's a lot of things going on. The mechanics of making that happen is certainly interesting, with the reverse repos, the doubling of the interest payment on the excess reserves, which doesn't seem to make any sense at all as to why they would want to do that. But of course, they're not really working for us anyway. But I'm sure you've got some thoughts on what has transpired in 2015, but also what you expect, the spillover effect, the intended or even unintended consequences of all this in 2016. And so I'll just shut up now, Jim, and you just run with it from there.
Well, you opened up a real big can of worms, as I hoped you would.
Maybe we could talk about this one for the next half hour. Go ahead.
Well, that would be very fitting. I would like to have a preface that I believe QE4, not the one that followed 3, QE4 was launched in October 2014 when we announced that the Japanese government pension fund of $1.2 trillion was going to be confiscated. And Japan reacted by saying, we're going to go to QE to infinity. They called it an infinite QE. They called it, at the Bank of Japan, an infinite volume QE. That was to support the treasury bond from foreign outpost called Japan, which is basically a slave state. They needed the infinite QE to replace the $1.2 trillion in Japanese government bonds that we stole so that we could convert them to treasury bonds. That was QE4. QE5 was a blended event where the center was BRICS. Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland, Cayman, and Switzerland, which in the last 2 years and more have supported an equal volume as the Fed for treasury bond purchases off printed money. $420 billion in 2+ years for the BRICS. So, we made Japan an official QE outpost, and we made the BRICS official QE satellites. Now we come to the present day and the supposed 0.25%, 25 basis point rate hike. I ask, well, if it was really a 25 basis point rate hike, why 10 days later was the effective Fed funds rate not anywhere near 25 basis points higher? See, I don't read headlines. I read the data behind the story, and I read the inner workings of the press release and what else they mention that the knuckleheads usually gloss over which in this case was amplified reverse repo and the doubling of the rate offered, the yield offered, the excess reserves.
Yeah.
So what they doubled the excess reserves to draw in more funds to make their load lighter in the QE hyperinflation printed volume. Okay, if the banks want to cooperate by shoving us some of their treasuries, well, fine, that'll lighten our load. That's good. Okay, but why was the effective Fed funds rate 10 days later, only several basis points higher? It wasn't 25. Why was that? Because they didn't do a 25 basis point rate hike. They told you they were going to.
Mm-hmm.
Just like in the summer months of 2013, they told us they were going to do a rate hike. The market called their bluff. They backed down, and it was called taper talk. Taper talk is a nice label for Fed bullshit.
Jawbone.
Jawbone bullshit. I like calling it bullshit because it was bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't know what bullshit is, it's the stuff that comes out of the Fed mouths that never happens.
Right.
Okay, so what else did the Fed announce? They announced an amplified repo, reverse repo. Okay, I'm going to make an admission here because I'm an honest analyst and honest broker. I thought for the last few months, when we saw the failures to deliver for Treasury bonds,
mm-hmm.
amounting to $40 billion a day, which if you just use the business days, multiply, you get about $1 trillion a month.
Right.
And then I saw the reverse repo volume go up $1 trillion a month in September, $1 trillion a month in October.
Right.
I thought, okay, bingo. There's your supply.
Right.
That's the under-the-table supply from the Fed to the Wall Street banks. Well, I got it backwards. But I'd like to explain what it means in the backward dynamic.
Please do.
And how it ties to reality as I got corrected by someone in my group of colleagues.
Please do, because that seemed to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it made too much sense, and I grabbed on it. Okay, I'm really not dead wrong in the final wash. I'm wrong in the direction of that reverse repo movement. What happened was the Fed drew in money. It didn't dish out money.
Right.
The reverse repo is taking in money without receiving collateral.
You're right. You're
bonds and bills.
You're bringing in cash and flushing in exchange for the bonds and the bills.
Right, but there's no collateral. Therefore, it's called reverse repo.
Right.
Repo is, say, Walmart or Office Depot or Costco or IBM. They supply $2 billion worth of Treasury bills and they get cash for it. They supply the collateral and they get cash for it. Reverse repo is cash just comes to the Fed with no collateral posted. They do reverse.
Right.
They soak up liquidity.
Right.
But here's the missing piece that I didn't understand, and Rob Kirby straightened me out. And, I will never admit, when it comes to the bond market and all the interest rate derivatives and all their different inner work, I will never say, I got this all figured out.
Oh, I hear you.
Oh, man, they make it so complicated not to confuse us, but to rig the system. Here's what I've come to learn. The Fed went out and drew in money for the unexpressed purpose of allowing the Department of Treasury to do all that heavy lifting in the Exchange Stabilization Fund. The reverse repo high volume was a signal to the rest of us, mere mortals, the ones who put on our underwear one leg at a time. It was a signal that the Exchange Stabilization Fund is now the second QE. This is very big. What it means is now we've got double QE to infinity. We've got the Fed printing money and buying bonds, but we've also got the Department of Treasury employing their exchange stabilization fund, which, by the way, has their mitts, their hands, in any major 10 or 12 markets in the world, starting with currency. So when you saw the Chinese sell $250 billion worth of treasury bonds, a massive dumping, which happened, not coincidentally, right after they got refused the IMF basket inclusion for special drawing rights.
At the end of the summer,
Right, okay, so Chinese said, okay, you're going to give us an FU, we'll give you an FU. Or maybe better described, as my colleague said, you're going to flip us the bird, we're going to give you a giant FU. So, why is it that the Treasury bonds saw a $250 billion dumping exercise by China, yet the 10-year yield stayed right around 2.0?
Yeah, imagine it didn't move at all. You're right.
That's work by the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Now, I've been pointing out that every Tom, Dick, and Harry out there is dumping treasury bonds across the world. Their central banks are dumping it because they don't like QE, they don't like the undermine to their savings account. If you're saving in something and you put it in a certain barrel, and your neighbor comes out with counterfeit items that are exactly the same as within your barrel, you're not going to like it. You're going to do something about altering your method of saving in that barrel. And that's precisely what central banks around the world are doing. They're dumping their treasury bonds. And the Department of Treasury, not the Fed, is soaking it all up. We've got double QE to infinity now. So
let me jump in, because I want to try to summarize what you've just said to see if I'm getting this correct. So the reason for the reverse repo facility, and I guess you could even extend this. Before I extend it, the reason for the reverse repo facility is to exchange Fed Treasury, the treasuries held on the Fed balance sheet for cash that the banks had received from the Fed in the first place through QE, because the Fed creates money and buys these shit bonds and the shit mortgage-backed securities from the banks. That is worth pennies on the dollar, but sometimes, as John Titus has shown from the notes of the Fed meetings in 2009, they actually paid a premium for some of this crap. So now the banks have all this cash on their balance sheet that's built up to $2.7 trillion in excess reserves. And so the Fed is doing these reverse repos to get their hands on that cash, which then they can shuffle off to Treasury to put into the Exchange Stabilization Fund, where now all that money can be sent out to buy derivatives, whatever, to affect all these global markets.
Well, I agree with that assessment, and I would add something what I believe is quite important.
But is that am I accurately summarizing what you said? Okay.
Yes. And here's the bottom line motive, though, in addition to everything else we said. It's not just to soak up all the treasury bonds. It's not just to avoid seeing the U.S. government interest rate rise like Greece.
Right.
We should have a rate like Greece, because our fundamentals are just as bad as Greece.
Worse.
Or worse. What the Fed is doing is making sure the big banks are loaded up with treasury bonds and treasury bills so that they can leverage off them.
Yeah.
This is the key.
Right.
If they're holding cash, they can't leverage off them. So the Fed is doing the reverse repos to take in the cash and make sure that the big banks are loaded up with treasuries with which to leverage.
As collateral to leverage.
And to conform with the derivatives.
Right.
The derivatives have treasuries as their foundations for leverage. Now, what does that mean? It means the Tower of Babel is even more narrow now than it's ever been.
And stacked higher.
It's stacked higher and it's narrower. So they've got bigger leverage with all the big banks, which means that any external exogenous shock is going to be more powerfully felt by the big banks. I'm not just referring to Wall Street. I'm referring to London banks,
German banks,
big German and French banks, and forget about the Italian and Spanish banks. They're all basket cases. They're pretty much dead men walking. But, you know, when it comes to the French, they got Societe Generale and PNB Paribas and what's the third? Credit Agricole. The Germans have half a dozen good-sized banks. They're all in trouble.
Right. And they all hold each other's debt.
Right. So what I call it the fake Fed rate hike. The fake Fed rate hike did not result in the effective Fed funds going up like they said, 25 basis points. It was merely a bunch of smoke and mirrors with some levers being pulled in the background on excess reserves, reverse repo, and increased leverage for the big banks. While the same foreign outposts continue to do the exported QE in Japan and the BRICS nations.
Yeah. And ECB.
It's not BRICS, it's BRICS.
Right.
Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland, Cayman, or Caribbean.
And the ECB is buying up all the crap too.
Oh gosh, ECB is maybe worse than the Fed because they're dealing with a problematic euro currency. So they're defending a falling currency, and they don't want an inflation wave to hit the European economy. That's what happens when you have a falling currency.
Sure. Yeah.
Everything you import costs more.
All right. So Jim, you mentioned maybe we'll segue to the I guess this might be the third topic, last topic that we'll cover because as this all ties together. We've talked about Syria, the Middle East, the energy, the petrodollar, all of that stuff, and really the first segment. And we just got finished talking about I guess we'll just call it the fake monetary policy that's sold to everybody as, well, yes, the Fed is raising rates because the economy is so strong, and it's all just crap. It's all bullshit.
But watch
nonsense.
the dollar continue to rise, though, as an unwanted consequence.
So exactly. So we've got that piece of the puzzle, but as you then said, all this is doing is exacerbating the ultimate problem, which is this pile of debt, this debt-based, derivative debt-based system that is accumulated in this teetering Tower of Babel, as you've described it now for a couple of years. Let's in our last segment, let's tie these two things together, energy and debt. And I think where that can then be found is how we tie this together is a falling price of crude oil, what that does to those economies, what that does for derivatives that are written on that falling price of crude oil, and the impact that's had on the balance sheets of all these major banks. We can talk about geopolitically what the falling price of oil does, but we can maybe even more significantly here in the U.S. what the falling price of oil has done to that nascent shale and fracking industry. And all of those companies that sprung from the ground over the last 5 years that were going to profit from that funded themselves with debt issuance that is high-yield debt that was gobbled up by investors everywhere that were just scrambling for any kind of yield because of these central bank ZIRP and NIRP policies. Regular investors get stuck buying all of this crap from these companies now that may very well be out of business 6 months from now if they can even make it that much longer because of the price of energy, the price of oil. So all of this seems to tie together because then as the bond markets, the credit markets begin to contract and teeter, and the derivatives on these energy contracts and the derivatives on the high yield markets and everything else, all of that begins to, that's the one piece of the Jenga puzzle tower that could be pulled out that could collapse everything. So here's another 3-minute introduction to our to our last segment. But maybe explain to everybody, if I've got that right, how this all kind of connects and how you can see how that might impact things in the coming 12 months.
Well, I like to focus on the bad debt, the impaired credit portfolios, as they like to call it. Doesn't that sound impressive?
It does.
We have an impaired portfolio. Well, it makes it sound like it's still worth investing in, right?
Yes, it's just impaired is all.
It's only impaired. I mean, it's got a limp. It's got a limp. Okay. It's not just the shale nascent industry you describe. It's a little more than that. It's some more costly standard conventional oil industry. Not the ones, not the projects that have are really, really nice $20, $30, $40 cost per barrel. No. The ones there's plenty of North American oil business that's not shale. That's marginal, and it's all at risk of going bad. And when you're talking about, I don't have a name of a company in mind, but let's just use the name Baker Hughes. Baker Hughes might have a project where they've got $60 to $70 per barrel as their cost of getting oil out of the ground. And I'm not necessarily talking about shale. Way too much attention has been given to shale.
Sure.
To be sure, it is on the margin and the most vulnerable of all on the margin. But there's more on the margin than just shale. You've got a lot of the tar sands in Alberta, the whole Athabasca area, that's at risk too.
Yep.
And I hear from my Canadian clients that there's not much rail movement of the tar sand oil going to the Pacific ports in Vancouver or British Columbia. There's not much going on. Okay, so you've got a tremendous amount of marginal oil business that's at risk of going kaput. Now, how does a company like Baker Hughes protect itself? They put on an oil hedge. When you have $100 oil, this was 18 months ago, you put on an oil hedge to sell forward your oil production, and you don't run a risk with a leveraged futures bet. Instead, you do the opposite. You deliver into your sold contracts. It's the opposite of the risk.
Right.
It's, okay, I've got a promise to sell you 100 baseball bats for spring training next February. Okay, I'm not taking a risk. I'm going to deliver them because I cut the wood and I got my lathe working. I'm making it. Okay.
And you've already told me what you're going to pay me for those, regardless of what the market price is next spring. We've determined already what that price is.
We're locked into contracts, and that's why they lock into those oil hedges. Well, I believe a lot of the failures to deliver for Treasury bonds sold this late summer and early autumn were done by Wall Street banks, essentially doing naked selling, naked shorting of Treasury bonds. They were backed up by the Exchange Stabilization Fund at the Department of Treasury to make sure these big banks would not fail from underwriting oil hedges. That's how they got bailed out. And just take a look at the reverse repo volume, and you see between $1.5 and $2 trillion worth.
Yeah, interesting.
Now that might be a little more than just the oil hedges. It might be the portfolios of the wreck companies. In order to have a hedge book, you've got to have a business to produce the oil. And to have a business, you need to have working capital. A lot of the working capital is going to go bad, just like the oil hedges. So it's not just what's the volume of oil, multiply the barrels, what's the differential on the oil price. And it's more than that. It's the capital behind the oil industry that's stuck at the margin for, gray area, not producing it at a profitable level. All right, so you got a lot of oil industry bad debt and but losses due to oil hedges underwritten by the big banks. All right, fine. What other big debt is sitting out there? It's emerging market debt. They were told, borrow at the real cheap interest rate. Isn't that what zero interest rate's all about? To make it easy to get through the storm? Well, now they got to backfire because let's just take, I don't have another great example. I'm just going to make it up. Bangladesh. I don't even know what their debt is. I don't care. I'm making an argument here. Let's suppose Bangladesh has, a few dozen $1 billion worth of debt. What happens to it when their currency goes down? It amplifies the obligation. And not only does a country like Bangladesh have a debt in dollar denomination that's going up in volume on a relative basis from their viewpoint, but their economy is hurting. Mm-hmm. So they've got a reduced ability to service the debt. They're not able to sell their shipped goods, their exported goods so easily because U.S. is stuck in an interminable recession, if not depression, called a sluggish recovery. So, what's the volume of all this emerging market debt? Oh, if you just do a simple definition of what an emerging market is, you might get $5 trillion worth of debt. Well, if you do an expanded definition of what an emerging market is, you might get up to maybe $11 trillion worth of debt. That's not billion, it's trillion.
Unbelievable.
So why are we not seeing some of this debt go bad and default? Because the Western banks are supplying additional debt to patch over the debt service costs. Right. Because if the debt for the emerging market goes bad, the big Western bank is going to have to make an announcement that the Bangladesh debt of $37 billion has gone bad. They're going to have to report it in their quarter. They can't put it on any 90-day bullshit list anymore. They're going to have to declare the loss. They're going to have to exhaust their loan loss reserves. They're going to have to hit the quarterly earnings per share. And they're going to have to deal with the whole concept of contagion. Mm-hmm. Because what other bank might be linked at the hip with this one Western bank that took the Bangladesh loss? Then you discover, 3 Spanish banks and 1 French bank are also at risk of going bad, and there's a run on their bonds. So the Fed steps in, the Bank of England steps in as a proxy, the European Central Bank steps in, and they all put patches on. That's why you're not seeing it yet. They're putting patches on the debt service. Right. And I think in 2016, there's a new fuse. And the Voice described this rather capably, not with a lot of flowery prose, but he said, we're going to see sub-30 oil price, and it's going to cause a lot of problems immediately. In other words, they're not going to be able to patch it so easily. I put out an email immediately to my entire group of colleagues. Sounds like you're describing a series of big bank events. And he tacitly agreed. Yeah. So we're going to see some events, and it's going to happen in 2016. We've got two factors now that are new, that are going to push down the oil price even further. It's the Iran oil supply that's been sitting around in 20 gigantic oil tankers to the tune of about 100 million barrels of oil. And the Iran nuclear talk agreement made it possible, and not so much legal, but made it so that it's an approved commercial practice now across the world, that they're going to sell 500,000 barrels of oil a day, and then in 3 months they're going to sell another 500,000 to make it a full 1,000,000 barrels a day of their stored inventory that's floating. They commissioned Chinese shipbuilders to make them a few extra vessels. Meanwhile, they're still producing oil, so there's going to be this glut from Iran. Meanwhile, the U.S. government changed their law to permit export of our oil.
Right, right.
Precisely at the time that our banks desperately do not want a lower oil price. Right. So we've got the government at loggerheads conflict, U.S. government, Washington, at loggerheads conflict with the Wall Street banks.
Right.
Who are sitting on this gigantic, impaired credit portfolio.
So expand on that, Jim, because I'm thinking the same thing while you're talking. I was thinking about that Iran deal. I mean, clearly, that came at a time where if you're going to all of a sudden allow Iranian oil, that's just going to depress price even more. And again, at loggerheads with what the banks might need. And now you're describing what just happened, this kind of historic, I guess, rescission of that law about U.S. being able to export oil. I mean, that only increases the glut and increases pressure on price, which is not what the banks need. So can you go further into that?
How about the motives behind and the factors behind, the pressures behind the Iran nuclear talks?
That's what I mean. Well, I mean, why are they doing this if it is hurtful to their system? If you know what I mean? I mean, if it is...
China told them to.
Oh, okay. Well, then there you go.
It's that simple. China told them to. Europe told them to. Europe secretly despises the U.S. government interference with Iran sanctions. Notice the Swiss had been hauled on the carpet at UBS and Credit Suisse for violations of what? The Iran sanctions. So the Swiss have lost control of their two biggest banks because of violations of the U.S. government's unilateral declaration, meaning no other country was really with them except, maybe our masters in England. I mean, anytime you talk about the U.S., you really need to talk about U.S.-UK.
Yeah, the money masters, the money side.
The money masters and the Anglo-American bankers. Right. Okay, so the Europeans said, we're sick of your rules. The French said, we don't like PNB Paribas hauled on the carpet either for Iran sanctions. We're all moving money around. We're all violating the sanctions. Money moving around helps our economy stay firm, and the U.S. is dead set on ruining all the European economy. The Russian sanctions are designed to ruin the European economy. If the U.S. economy is going to get ruined, we bloody well want the European economy to get ruined. So China and Europe got together and said, we've had enough of this. And there's another factor here, and it is that lots and lots of nations are really sick of Israel. And I have been going on for, I'm in business now 11 and a half years with the newsletter. And I would say the first 9 and a half or 10 and a half years, I've been treating Israel with kid gloves. And there's a real good reason why.
Right, you've told us about that before.
The death threats that came from them. But now you've got all these exaggerated claims of Iranian nuclear capability. I remind you, they don't have a missile delivery system. So the Israelis said, well, yeah, they can always deliver them in suitcases. They can do dirty nukes. They can do micro nukes. They can do lots of different things. They can have allies work. Okay, fine. They don't even have sufficient refinement capabilities. Their facilities have been blocked for equipment, and the Stuxnet, S-T-U-X-net,
right, the worm,
was a massive project by the U.S. government and MI6, Langley, all of them, to inject viruses into the Iranian I don't know how to call it, not their economy,
their
not
infrastructure, their nuclear
infrastructure, but really into their military and call it official infrastructure. You know, the government, banking systems, and military, nuclear, energy, and all that. The official systems. Okay, and the Stuxnet was very successful. And Iran turned around and had their own revenge, and they stole a few. This is not something that the U.S. military wants to get out. They stole a few drones,
right,
and had them land in Tehran.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a battle going on behind the scenes. Stuxnet resulted in Iranians doing something in return. You know, students of history are quick to point out that the Persian Empire has existed for 5,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
Where's it been the last 100 years? It's been suppressed. It's been kept down. The U.S. was deeply involved in removing Mossadegh.
Right.
In the 50s. Who did we replace him with?
The Shah.
The Shah of Iran. A shining star of global liberties, right? No, he was the architect of Savak. Savak was their nasty, murderous secret police that went all across Europe murdering people, mostly Iranians. Okay, followed by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who just happened to spend a large part of his life in France. So, was that another plant to make sure that some religious nutball would come in there and make sure that the mullahs would steal a lot of the oil and have Swiss bank accounts? Oh boy, this is so convoluted, it's pathetic.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, the Iran nuclear talks were basically Europe, and in particular China, saying enough.
So
China has a motive. Let me just go on. Last point.
Right.
China has a motive to make sure that the Persian Gulf is a peaceful region. And the only way they can do that is if the Iranians are an accepted member of that society in the Persian Gulf. But it's just not working out that way, because the Yemen war is nothing but a battle of Iran versus the Saudis.
Yes, it is. So then, Jim, kind of going back to then the derivative issue and the debt-based society that, you know, everything, it's all reaching this exponential form, and we've been talking about this for years. As we look at 2016, and as you said, the voice has told you, sub-$30 oil is where, I mean, we thought maybe sub-60. I'm not saying we. I've read things, not from you, about sub-$60 oil and then sub-$40 oil. But your guy has said sub-30 is where we really have issues from the banks and their derivative contracts, and then the debt that's written as well. Is that going to be then ultimately, you think, the defining, or it's hard to say, I shouldn't say the defining issue of 2016, but
a major
issue. Yeah.
Yes, a major lit view. And I've been inquiring and thinking about this. Why? Because when it goes under 30, the banks say, "Oh, we've had enough. We can't do this anymore. We can't extend." Okay, when you've got a bad debtor, you extend him a little bit more.
Right.
To keep him going.
Afloat, yeah.
On the hope that he can turn it around.
Right.
What happens when you see sub-30 oil? You conclude it ain't going to get turned around.
No hope.
No hope. So they stop doing the patches. And furthermore, when they stop doing the patches, it's going to be just about coincidental with the timing that the oil hedges expire as contracts. It's going to be a double hit. And
when is that?
I'm hearing January, February, March.
Yeah, you've said that before, that it was in the first quarter of 2016.
And look at March as being right at the beat, 1 month before the start of a lot of activity when maybe the ground thaws out. Think of like, April.
Yeah.
April in Boston. April in Boston is a turnaround month. I lived there for 20 years, and you might still get one more snowstorm, but by the time you're into April, you get a little sun. You might have to cut your lawn. Okay, but in Canada, maybe it's a little later. So March is critical because that's when they start the hedges, and that's when they expire. Right before the thaw, right before the projects begin. You can't do anything when the ground is a mess.
I'm sitting here thinking to myself, a conversation I had here over the holidays with a really smart guy, very in touch, understands the way the market works.
He must not have been in your family.
Loosely connected, I guess. But and I was explaining to him the stuff that I've written about at my site about how the current price action in the S&P 500 is mimicking almost exactly what we saw in 2000 and in 2008 at the last bull market tops. And again, this is all presuming that we still have some type of functioning market that isn't just an illusion. Nonetheless, the chart activity on the monthly chart looks identical. The breakdown in August, followed by the rally, and now here we're rolling over again. And the smart guy looked at me and said, yeah, but I don't see the bubble this time. I don't see, we had the dot-com bubble in 2000 and that burst and that drove everything down. Then we had the real estate bubble in 2007 and that burst drove everything down. And what's the bubble this time?
Oil and hedges.
Yeah, it's all right below the surface. You can't see it this time.
Well, it's not even below the surface. It's all over the place. But you have a hard time convincing a conventional financial analyst type that the oil industry is high risk.
Right.
They just don't buy it.
Right.
It's not in their DNA.
That's true.
They say, oh, no, that's energy. Energy is pretty firm.
Yeah, there's no
Not
demand.
this time.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to close with something, Craig.
Go ahead.
I mean, we might have several more minutes, but I want to get this in. You're talking about the S&P and being vulnerable and what's the pinprick and where's the subprime this time? Well, the subprime is not on the domestic side, it's oil and hedges. But on the foreign side, it's all the emerging markets. Is this guy stupid or blind or both?
Yeah.
Okay, here's my interpretation. I get some hate mail once in a while.
No.
And I'm very pleased to say that when I mentioned before, like in May and June and back, several months ago, I was getting a good deal of hate mail. I am very pleased to tell you that it's 90% less. Because I think it's becoming quite readily noticeable.
Yeah.
The things I was talking about are happening.
Right.
Okay. The predominant theme of the hate mail is the dollar's going up, you idiot. You got that wrong. The dollar's not crashing. The dollar's still going up. Which means that the idiot didn't comprehend my forecast. I said over and over and over again, the dollar's going to rise and rise and rise, cause significant problems, and then vanish.
Then boom.
When it vanishes, it's going to be rising. So this Fed rate hike, whatever it is somewhat psychological. Mm-hmm. The reaction in the market is somewhat lift the dollar.
Right.
Send down the Bangladesh currency. Send down the Brazil real. Send down the Mexican currency. Mexico is having a major currency crisis right now. So let me describe in kind of a final preface. It should have been in the very beginning. When we got rid of the gold standard behind the dollar, that was 1971. We call that the Bretton Woods gold standard. We got rid of it in 71, and we quickly made the petrodollar de facto standard in 73.
Yep.
So, for 40 years, we've essentially had... Now, the real technical people would say, oh, no, Jim, we don't really have an oil standard. You cannot redeem the dollars and receive oil. Oh, really?
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what the oil market does. Okay,
Good
so
point.
that's how they buy oil.
That's
So
how they
it's
sell
not
oil.
redeeming them, it's buying oil, not redeeming
Right.
the treasury bills.
Right.
It's precisely the same thing,
Yeah. Good
but
point.
from a viewpoint on the other side of the table.
Right.
Okay, so the oil asset has been the foundation backing for the dollar. I make the point, the dollar's dying, and the evidence is the declining oil price. As the oil price declines, you have all these different cantilevered derivatives that sends the dollar up. I've been making a point for several months now. One of the major reasons the dollar is rising is the falling oil price and all the derivatives denominated in the dollar terms. So, as the oil price falls, the dollar rises. And there's another cantilevered effect, and that is with gold versus the dollar. The secondary reaction is oil goes down, dollar goes